still here. Would you like me to start over? In doing so, we aim to illuminate the longer history of this land we call home, our relationship to this history, and the heritage of those peoples whose ancestors lived here before the European American immigration at the end.
Thank you so much. Did everyone have a chance to look at the agenda? And do you have anything you want to add or discuss about it before we adopt it? Okay, I'll take a motion on it then, please.
I move to adopt the agenda.
Thank you. Thank you. Any discussion? Sorry, wrong order. None. Okay, all those in favor of adopting the agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, David. We're just adopting the agenda right now. Yeah. Okay. All right, what about the meeting minutes? Did you all have a chance to review those? Would somebody make a motion to bring them to the table? Or actually, I think the motion is like to adopt the minutes. Okay. Second. Thank you. Any discussion on the minutes? Were there any errors or any corrections that you want to propose? Something pretty tight. Okay. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of adopting the minutes as published, please say aye.
Aye.
All those in Excellent. Okay, that passes, and that takes us to our next meeting date, second Tuesday of the month. Public hearing. Okay, and then we don't have anybody in attendance, do we? For comment?
So there's 4 participants, so I don't know.
think that's
There might be somebody.
Oh, yeah, the students are all panelists. Me and Nick. Let's say.
But you're on camera, so probably.
Yeah.
That's it. All right, we'll keep an eye on that. All right, so no citizen comments and no report from the city council liaison. We're gonna be done in about 5 minutes. So hopefully we'll hear from Councilmember Bodie next time. Particularly, I think they've been very busy with South Transit. Okay, so that takes us right into the comp plan update. And there's 2 items tonight. One is, I guess, Steve, are you going to take us through review of the 2 bills that passed, or at least that have gone to the governor, and then get a little update on the selection process, and that's it. We might have to read it. Since we don't have a consultant on board yet, we can't, like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to dig in. So hopefully there's going to be something on that update.
Yeah. we're trying to look
Okay.
So really, I've just been able to kind of dig into one of the bills that was I think the governor signed.
Sam, can you hear Steve?
And so that's House Bill 1110, and it essentially it's the one that changes or frees up whatever we have in the way of single family zoning to either allow something that's being 2 units on each lot or up to 6 in some cases for larger cities. So these are kind of the ways it broke down. Cities over 75,000 with about 4 plexes everywhere. There's single family zones, 6 plus plexes next to major transit stops. So anything like a rapid ride bus transit, rapid bus transit is a major stop, or of course light rail, commuter trains. And then tier 2 cities 25 to 75,000. They must duplexes everywhere, and 4 plexes within a quarter mile transit stops. Then we are in tier 3, which is cities that are less than 25,000. We're in a contiguous open growth areas, EPA stands for, with cities larger than 200 75,000. So we are required to allow duplexes of other single basic. There is an alternative compliance path. If you do this on, you could exclude 25% of your single family lots for purposes if you have critical areas. There's a few other reasons. It also said that you couldn't exclude those 25% based on if they had historic exclusionary covenants, which we know some of the subdivisions like Forest Park have. So I don't know how critical areas and that are going to. Great thing is we have until 6 months after we adopt the comprehensive plan to figure this out and adopt regulations that are compliant.
So that'd be mid-25.
Mid-25. So and this is something that our consultant has figured out how to get as well. So I think with the half mile on transit stops, it's going to be something that's still contend with because we're not going to be able to require as much parking, maybe not any parking, those new units within that half mile. And then this won't be an issue really. We didn't have that many lots under 6,000 meters on per single family, so whether they have 1 or 2 spaces, it's not going to affect many lots. And then this just the definition I mentioned, major transit stop. The other thing is that all of these new units are supposed to have a covenant on there that runs with the property that says for 50 years that they have to be affordable. And they're defining affordable as some 60% median income rentals. They have to be affordable to 2 people who make 60% of the median regional area income rentals. And then and this is a whole other question: if you could sell these units, and you could on they're all new units, it seems like, but then it's got they have to be affordable to people who make 80% of that area median income basically. Puget Sound Regional Council, PSRC, did some analysis, and I just thought it'd be useful to just kind of look at, these are the cities that are affected, various shades of green, and we're right up here. And so you can see that that definition pulls cities like us and Kenmore, Woodinville into this, as well as the Dinah, Hunts Point type cities. I think this is Newcastle, yes. So even Normandy Park here. So yeah, but I think it's not a heavy lift to figure out a way to deal with 2 units, especially we say, look, we're probably will have to loosen up our accessory dwelling regulations that you can't have an over. But there will be a whole lot. It's not going to be a dramatic change. So the kind of relay this with major transit stops, and we do have some of these major transit stops. You can see right along here on 522 that with the improvements that Sound Transit is making, we're going to have bus route transit. So that's why our stops now. They did some analysis that of there are 537,000 parcels in the region that are affected by this, and they think that based on their assumptions, that maybe about 100,000 in the next 20 to 30 years might be redeveloped under these provisions. So this is a lot of assumptions, and we're going to have to get there exactly. But that is a significant, it's a significant amount of new dwellings. Here, 30 years, and what we understand is like every year we're like having, a shortage of 50,000 units in 2019, up to 70,000 now. So this could start to make a difference in the next 3 to 5 years. But I don't think, as they're saying, it's not going to completely change the landscape. As you were just saying, there's a lot to think about whether you add another unit from the front and whether you want to do that. So just to give us perspective. So this is kind of what that looks like when you say, well, here are all the parcels that are subject to the legislation. The blue ones are the ones near transit stops. And what they're saying, the other side is these are the ones they think are most likely to redevelop. And so it's just kind of a patchwork. It's slightly less dense than, and it's, it looks like it's really these inner areas in Seattle that might have this intensity based on this scenario. So, that's kind of what I've been able to glean so far this week. I think it's going to have the most effect. The other ones are we have to change our parking. Okay. So we've got a lot of time to figure out how to make these, how to be in compliance. Any thoughts, questions from anyone?
I'm just curious because one of the things that I learned about in the short course was that the Supreme Court has said in the Village of Euclid versus Amber Realty 1926 that cities have the right to zone, but do states have the right to zone? I'm just wondering if that even constitutional thing for them to do. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we could ask our city attorney. Most state legislation, most city legislation is very enabled by the state to do certain things, and the state, in a lot of situations, can take away something that cities can do and add to the things that cities can do. So I don't think it would be, this is not, we're not treading new ground here. We're in California, we've done the same thing. I think that those that have arrived in federal court, well before Washington started looking at it, that might have done something different after here. That was the case. Really, cities are really creatures of cities and counties, creatures of the state. Can't really exist, even though there may be some. May have started with federal. First zoning case, but I think states can supersede what be more strict.
The other thing I had a question of is it says that if specific funding for the purpose of the very last section, for the purpose of this act, referencing this act by bill or chapter number is provided by June 30th, and that was the best appropriations act. So if it is also being attached to this.
Yeah, I guess what it's saying is that the Department of Commerce is throughout this is told they need to develop, assistance plans for assisting jurisdictions to implement. So I would assume it's talking about that. Which section was
That was just the very last one, section 15.
Okay.
So does that only that's only referring to the section of it, that first section?
Yeah, I don't think there wasn't any funding
Yeah.
discussed for local jurisdictions here. Usually the funding is tied to our. Yes, they don't really need to get this more funding yet. Maybe.
I like the idea of adding this to our plan for our consultant. help
Yeah, we
us
definitely have to address that.
navigate this, yeah.
Yeah, it's already talked about. Broadway scope. So, yeah, we could go on to that, we talk about this.
Sam, do you have any questions of Steve about House Bill? Either of those House bills?
I guess the only question I have is whether there's any precedent in our zoning code currently or any model for how you would contemplate that covenant requirement. That seemed to be rather unique, and it kind of evoked the conversation we had the other month with the nonprofit. So I'm wondering if we have any point of view on what those covenants might look like, or what the city's role in prescribing that in our zoning code might look like.
We have some other portions of the code, more of the environmental sections that require certain things to be recorded against the property related to like critical areas. So this is going to be a unique, set of provisions that I'm sure that that's one of the things that the state Department of Commerce is tasked with coming up with a model ordinance. So I would imagine that model ordinance would give us the language that we would need to have to tell somebody, here, take this down to the county assessor's office and record this if he wants to approve your building permit at that same unit. So that'll come probably. That's one of the key areas where we'll be looking for Congress to assist us.
It also strikes me that in addition to the Commerce's example that they provide, we might benefit from maybe workshopping or reaching out to the land trust from the other month to see if they have any thoughts, given that the kind of covenant model is the main way that they kind of preserve affordability through their model as well. They may have some different perspectives, and it might be useful for us to consider both perspectives when landing on what we ultimately do.
Certainly. Good idea.
I don't remember, I didn't mark this, and maybe you did, Meredith, but it seems like there was a section in there that it implied that cities could potentially have a more rigorous affordability plan. So it seems like reading that if you built a duplex, that one could be at market rate, but the other one has to be affordable for 50 years. But I feel like I read further down something about we might have the latitude to have more rigorous requirements for affordability. Do you recall that section?
I don't recall, but that's frequently the case. You have one restricted, we just can't, less restricted.
But it's probably not in a duplex, right? It would have to be in Omega, where there's more than one should have to probably be for economic.
Yeah, it seemed to say, did it say like 50%?
I think, yeah. So I think in a duplex, what is the reasonable use would ensure that one of the units could be at market value, but we could say anything above that initial unit.
Yeah.
I know we're not working on it right now, but I'm just kicking around. We've got 2 years to think about it, and I think it's going to be important that when we have our consultant on, that we have had, put some thought into, what our opportunities are to ensure affordability if we're going to, emergency. Also, I wonder what happens. So if we don't have to have this on the books for 2 years. What happens if someone wants to build a duplex now or a year from now? What do they have a right by state law, or do they have to wait until our code is updated?
They have to wait until our code is updated, or if you don't update at time, then the model ordinance goes into effect. Once we're late, supersedes whatever. Weeks by the time we get there.
And then I was curious because of the exclusion of any, I think it said any lots that have growth areas or buffers. What percentage of our parcels in Lake Park,
We don't have, that would be
that'd be good
part of
to
the
know where we're at.
study that we need to do responsible for. We started, figured out, because we were supposed to have a minimum of 4 units per year density. So we went through and figured out what percentage of the city limits and critical areas over to the buffers and, so like, because of that, so I think the groundwork has already been done, so that if we find that there's 25% that meets all the other criteria, it could be excluded from certain areas. I think it's helpful. So you were alluding to an interesting question, what would be reasonable use? Does somebody need to have the ability to build 2 units? Because that's always been the premise of reasonable use. Should, it's a single family lot, so you get to build 1 house, that would be reasonable use. If every part property is owned for duplexes, then you could use 2. So that's why I think that 25% that are excluded, they would say, well, those are still single family. So they're in critical areas.
Right.
And more than likely, they're going to be looking at areas where simply needed climate.
Yeah, that's how I read it, but I didn't read assumption. Also on page 11, row 38, it reads, the city must also allow 0 lot lines short of the subdivision where the number of lots created is equal to the unit density required in the subsection. What does that mean?
Shared wall. Translating up there, so I think you can have a shared wall. So. Let's 2 separate units, but shared.
So, yes, that seems reasonable, but is it, if so at our house, if we built a duplex, isn't the whole parcel belonging to like both homeowners? And there's some sort of localized HOA like between the two, like, I'm guessing you would have to set that up because you're not subdividing the property.
You're saying it's a duplex lot, but you have to get subdivided. But
the designation is that if there's it can be that shared wall you're talking about, so that I know that this part of my duplex, this part of the lot belongs to this duplex.
Yeah.
But it's not subdivided, it's just designated within the.
I think this is one of the areas that I find really puzzling. How's that going to work out? Because clearly, if you want to sell property, do one of your 2 duplexes, it's a lot easier to get a lot between the rates. Selling this to you, we'll figure out maintenance as we go. But if you have to do a condominium, you have to set all of that stuff up.
Oh, right.
Some sort of mutual agreement. How you handle maintenance. So that's a good
Those
question.
are some things for us.
Yeah, so to me, I read it as the city has to allow that subject to occur, even shared wall.
That's why I don't know if it's semantics, because technically we're not subdividing, like our parcel is, we're in what is our 15 or 19, I can't remember. It's 19. Ours is 19, so we can't subdivide ours any further than what it is, but that's gonna be something to grapple with. Is it like a subdivision and it's on record now as being 2 parcels, or is it designated as another?
Yeah, that's one of those subtleties I think. Worked out.
So I guess I read it completely wrong. I was thinking that they were talking about your house that you have and then building a duplex in addition to the house that you already have.
You're limited to 2 dwellings. So if you have 1 dwelling, you could partition part of it off and say, well, that's now another dwelling. So then the question is, does that mean that you can effectively divide that property into 2 parcels, or is it still 1 parcel where
Shared,
like an apartment, the same parcel?
So what's the difference between an ADU that you already have and then what they're talking about now? So this now is just a parcel that add onto your house then?
I think the ADU, correct me if I'm wrong, has restrictions on size.
Yeah.
And placement, and this is, you have an envelope you can build in on a property that there's height restrictions, setbacks, pervious surface requirements, and so you have a certain envelope you can build in right now. And I think what they're saying is you can build in that same envelope and divide it in half. But But ADUs are different, because they're restricted, the size is restricted.
Interesting.
So these could be two equal sized
Yeah, I
units.
was reading it completely wrong then.
But, there wouldn't be any owner occupied requirement.
But that's 1337 that has that requirement, right? That it wants us to take that out.
I'm saying if somebody said, I'm doing the duplex,
Oh,
a year and a half, 2 years from now, and I'm gonna meet all the requirements, they could, if they do the duplex, they could
Right.
rent both of those out, it's like.
Exactly.
You rent a single family. But if you were, sort of ADU, the regulations stay the same, and the city doesn't have to change those, then, if you have an ADU, you'd have to live in one of them. That's really where all this has to be worked out. When you apply for this duplex project, we'll have to have like sort of a whole new set of application requirements. You know, you've got your thing set up where you're going to have the affordability part of it addressed, and whether or not you're going to actually call these two separate lots. Sure that you have to reach an understanding that, you know, okay, they're two separate lots, but you can't divide them yet again and say that they're two duplexes on each one. So that's what I wonder if they're going to work that out. We have to let them subdivide. How do we keep them say, well, now I want to have 4 lots and 2 or 4 dwellings. Things.
Last thing I have on my list is on page 12, row 35, it talks about that a city can make a case for, and there's some requirements for parking. So if we have decided on Brookside, for example, that we don't have pedestrian infrastructure, right, it's close enough to the transit center that, or, you know, to a bus stop that we would be able to require off-street parking. But I saw in there an option of doing a study or submitting the required paperwork to say it wouldn't be safe for us to have on-street parking. So I recognize the lever in there that we'll probably need to consider because of what we've identified in our safe streets as being problematic. So I just want to flag that as something that, you know, hopefully the consultant will flag all of this stuff for us, but we'll all need to be well versed on sort of safe streets and the different, you know, areas in our community that may be negatively impacted by that. This new legislation, and it looks like we have some options to make a case if there would be profound safety issues. So just when you read that, take a look at that.
Sure that there'll be lots of consultants out there saying we're credentialed to help you
Right.
figure out how to still require your parking.
Yeah. Which is above and beyond I think what we talked about having residential parking permits, maybe for some of our streets. I think there was some.
Yeah, I think this would just be, would allow you to continue to have the same parking.
Right. Well, there's going to be a lot of work. So, what about consultant selection?
Oh, Melissa had her hand raised.
That's okay. You just touched on it because I was wondering if there were things that we could do in terms of the street parking situation and, you know, requiring, again, like some sort of residential parking permit so that, you know, those areas that, you know, so because we don't have good sidewalks or good walking areas in a lot of the areas around here. I just see it becoming really dangerous if our streets get clogged up with cars and people trying to get in and out, and poor visibility for people who are trying to walk to school or the bus stop and that sort of thing. So that was my concern.
Well, and it may be too, I mean, I'm certainly no expert, but if we're thinking about these things and we're well read on our comp plan and these two new pieces of legislation, we're going to get in front of our consultant because we'll be prepared to ask those critical questions. You know, to your point, Melissa, you know, could we require somebody's developing to put sidewalks in, you know, and it might be a piecemeal approach with what's available to provide that infrastructure so we wouldn't have those safety impacts. And having that safe street plan that's already identified those, you know, priority areas, I think will give us a leg up on you know, some of the analysis that we have to do and trying to unpack what are our options here. So I think that's a good point, and hopefully all of you are prepared to spend the next year really diving into this and kind of coming prepared with questions and things you're wondering about, because I think my experience with town center was that made all the difference is when, you know, commissioners were prepared, we were able to ask much deeper questions of our consultant and move the process further along. If we didn't rely on the consultant to educate us for every bit.
Somewhat related, I don't know if you all heard about this story in the ADJOURN. I only heard it briefly. Did you hear about the territory of parking exceeds the amount of land that's available for housing? Did you see that?
Yeah, there's
No,
a new book.
Yeah, yeah,
Paved Paradise.
that's what it's called. That's right. Yeah, and what is something that
I'll
we,
send you guys the title. of it. It's
Okay.
really fascinating. Read it
Uh-huh.
right now. So you better come.
Oh, yeah, I love that. I thought you were gonna say the KOW piece that came out like maybe 2 weeks ago now, and Bill Radke, the weekend review, did you hear this? Where they talked with an academic and a developer, and the developer was saying, you know, as a, for example, they had a single family home in this community in Edmonton that they were building, and they had some townhome units. And they said, hands down, townhomes are way more lucrative for them because per unit, it cost them, they took like a 2,100 square foot single family home and a 2,100 square foot townhome. They said it costs $200,000 less to build a townhome than the single family home. And so where zoning allows, it's much more profitable for them because the sale price of the single family home, the townhome wasn't wildly different, but they saved money on building and still got the return times the number of townhomes. And I was like, that's crazy. And then the academic reluctantly acknowledged that building more housing wasn't going to create affordability. It ultimately helps slow the pace of increasing housing costs, which is very different than affordability. I feel like affordability keeps getting tossed around in this sort of careless, catchy way. You're like, oh, we'll just do more. And the reality is all the new housing is maybe just slowing the pace of increasing costs, but it's not touching affordability, which I was so glad the original House bill didn't have that requirement in. And it was something that was added, I think, the Senate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so,
Those can be a big difference.
yeah,
You can't just be able to luxury units.
right, exactly. Any other questions about the legislation before we move on to the?
So. Sure. We've released the RFQ, which is request for qualifications. We were talking about it here earlier this year. I was thinking it was going to be a request for proposals, but I think just getting qualifications gives the potential consultants the ability to respond quicker and gives us the ability to figure out one which we think is best suited to the city. And then ask them to prepare proposed scope of work. So the RFQ document goes into some, this is a potential scope of work, kind of touches on the things that we talked about, meaning including the idea of a report card and doing surveys and things like that. So you need to give folks, the consultants, 2 or 3 weeks to respond, and also give an opportunity to ask questions. So as of tomorrow, we may start getting questions, and then by the end of the week of the 26th, we get the feel for who is really interested in this based on their questions. And then they're due, the statements of qualifications are due June 5th. And so then once we get the proposals, then the selection committee would need to take that week to review the proposals, just to be familiar with the approaches of the various consultants. We've got 2 or 3 or 4 to choose from. And then we would hopefully have interviews that following June 12th to 16th. So, as we discussed, I think it would be great if we had a representative of the planning commission, as well as, I'm gonna ask the council, mayor, whether they want to be involved in this. And then we'll have a couple of staff members, and that would be the interviewing group and who would sort of rank the statements of qualifications, who we want to interview. It's our short list. These folks. And so, so I think the way to handle this is, go back, if you're really interested in doing this, look at your schedules. It's going to be a tough time. Choose. I mean, hopefully, with the too many vacations, but if, you can email me and the mayor, just let us know if you're interested. Then you can appoint somebody from the planning commission, and then we'll, want to have an availability for probably a meeting, like midweek of that June 5th meeting. I think that's a Monday. So we can talk about who our top 2 or 3 are for interviewing. And then it would probably just be one day interviewing, like a half day from probably afternoon. And then a decision could be made hopefully at the end of those interviews. So, yeah, so a couple hours the week of June 5th, half day, up in the afternoon, week of June 12th. If you're interested, let me know. CC me if you just but yeah, so then it's hard to predict beyond that, other than got to get this done by June 2024. But probably, hopefully, we might be able to get council approval of a contract. Second meeting in June. If not, I think definitely by the first meeting in July, we'll have a contract ready to go, so that by the July meeting, you're able to have a kickoff meeting. So start looking scope of work. So, yeah, that's kind of any thoughts, questions about that?
I don't have any concern of not having a big pool of people. I know that was talked about like many months ago. This is a little bit late in the process. Maybe that's about it.
Keep my fingers crossed, but yeah, I have some anxiety.
Okay, all right, yeah. Strategy.
Yeah.
Strategy and waiting to release the RFQ just to wait till the legislative session was over, or why didn't we wait until now?
Small staff, too much to do. So great to get to it early.
Well, I thought maybe that was strategic.
No.
It I'm looking at this, it seems like there is a possibility, it sounds like what you're saying, that for our July meeting, that would be our first meeting with consultant, that would be the nature of that meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, I'm just thinking ahead to our June meeting and wondering if we're still on a holding pattern, or is there something that we can be working on in June, or should we take a break because we'll probably be doubling up on meetings in the second half of the year?
I think we could decide now if you want to take a break in June, that would be fine. But then, keeping the option open that if there are some things that we can talk about that would be helpful, then we have the meeting. So, yeah, if there's a desire to skip the June meetings, it'll probably be a later agenda than this is.
Just an idea about that. What we, the alternative, I brought all the other commissions together. Thinking about like what could be, well, maybe it's too soon to determine how we might collaborate, but I'm just thinking having to initiate those relationships ahead of time.
I think that's something we kind of initiated before, so it would be good to be, that would be the only other thing that we think might be useful. It's just whatever your other commissions, if you haven't had a chance to, then taking a meeting off, it gives you the opportunity to spend that time and energy just catching up with the commission, if you would express interest. But you know, here's what's going on. But which, yeah, I think that there's gonna be more energy and more guidance once you have a consultant for, and you're saying, here's what we want to do. You as a commission, where we have Steve and this, all we know is we have some priorities. It's climate change, student equities, and those types of things. Want to keep it as strategic as possible, circuit wise, because we are kind of getting sort of late in the process. I think that's what you said. That, content is not that we need a major overhaul. Pretty good shape. Just need to bring it up to date. Hopefully, that's what you'll hear as you talk about what's in it. Your the communities and then in public engagement. So I know Meredith is talking about police departments, like some suggestions for updates. We talk about that. Put it into a PDF. Look at it.
Yeah, well, I had a little.
Yeah, that was, so, I don't remember if you were here, it was our February or March meeting that we had all agreed to go to particular meetings, and I know I went to the climate action meeting and collaboration, so we've already seeded that. I don't know, if you were gonna go to the tree board, if we talked with them about him. That's, so I think that's pretty good shape there.
So it sounds like Meredith, you wrote something up and submitted it to.
Yes, I mean, so, I don't know, do that something that we want to do? I know, like,
I only ask because I
a
haven't.
conversation.
I only ask because I haven't actually done that. I have got, I have my notes, but
Yeah.
I can submit them to the planning commission as a whole.
Yeah,
Can we use maybe the June as downtime to maybe collaborate on together? Would you guys be interested in that? Working like that, just kind of get ourselves a little thing. Like Bay Street, to kind of get that in our brain, and then we could get together with the lens to call it.
So kind of do a round robin report out of our different meetings with the, because the same streets plan and then what we talked about, operating with other committees and commissions.
You're right, that's right.
But we could do a report out where everybody, making their take and maybe look at particular parts of the comp plan that they think that group, to your point, Meredith, like, where does that fit within the comp plan? Like, what first does that touch? So we can maybe start with the consultants on, we can pre-map some of those collaboration points. To use Steve's language to be really surgical about the ways in which we're reaching out to partners.
We do like a posted party where we have, subjects that we want to post it, like we would have all of the comp plan for transportation, housing, kind of post it. It's something that feels like we should be more productive.
Oh, for sure.
I think it'd be good to just like the top three things that we keep on their discussions. Department or the commissions that we think is going to affect. That would be a good discussion. Just kind of think about where do we see that happening. So begin your discussion with the consultant here to say, hey, you've already done the groundwork here.
Yeah.
Here's what we hear from climate action. They're going to have this whole set of policies already developed. So first, it may be a little more are amorphous for what the tree board is thinking about. You may have to like really, you know, give them a little bit more encouragement to. But here's what the content is. Well, you've got this environmental quality section. Is there anything in there you think that should be updated based on kind of where you think the tree regulations are going? So I think that would be just a good discussion to have in terms of, you know, making sure that we somehow recorded what was learned from these. It can just be the meeting notes, so we can share those with ourselves. So we heard priorities for the parts of the action, tree board, safety department. So we can be a little prepared.
I want to formulate that maybe and create a lens with which, because I think, you know, kind of what you said earlier, I feel like there's just tweaks to the comp plan with, you know, in terms of the climate change. I remember as we were doing the meetings early on and going to the different sections, I remember thinking, oh, this would be a great place to insert like the housing issue, climate change, and just kind of start, you know, like, that's why I was going to post it notes or something with green. If you know the top three with public, you know, safety, and see how we can insert those into the trend.
What I kind of hear you describing is mapping out like the intersection points with the comp plan in each of these groups. Like if we understood what the tree board's top 3 priorities were right now, and we knew public safety and, you know, the climate action committee, we knew what their sort of their work plans look like for the year, where they were focusing their attention. Then we could do some of the mapping to say, you know, where do they logically sort of intersect and where should they intersect, even if it's not one of the priorities right now.
So yeah, and I don't think it'll be like a huge, you know, but I think if we can zero it down to like maybe the top 3 as you had suggested, I think at least it gives us kind of a framework and you know, just in the desire to streamline this and not see this drag out for, you know, 2 years. So, yeah. Just a thought, yeah, I would hate to this opportunity to actually have a working session. Stevie would have to come.
No, we gotta have a meeting. We touched on that in the short courses that you have a subcommittee, we actually had a meeting.
That's right.
That hasn't. So we might as well just all get, we should all get together to see what to do and reflect that on this. Planning commission meeting. Agenda may be wide open in terms of how we're coalescing this information. Be prepared to articulate the result. Fine. Open to however you want to do it, whiteboard or whatever. Just sending me narrative to send. Here's this.
Those are just the, like, I tried to rewrite it, but when I met with Parks, I looked at what they're doing, and then I sort of tried to find the policy points for parks and trails and community, and say, okay, this one is 8.2. You know, this is what I wanted to address. Is really everything that they're doing is very represented in either the parks and trails and or the community aspects. You know, they're all the things that there wasn't anything that I was like, oh, that's doesn't fit anywhere. You know, so it was all very in line. You know, the meeting with the chief Mike Hart and I did feel brought out some things I think as a city we could improve and just that we need to think about as a city.
Could we, is there any way we could get everybody's agendas out ahead of the meeting? So I'm putting the agendas on that, and then I don't know, maybe we'll come up with our own, our reading seems like the top 3 issues, and then we can put in your suggestion. Is there a way that we can send it?
For all of us to sort of follow Meredith's lead.
Well, so that's just like the text of the comp plan,
Right.
whereas I have notes of That's what I was thinking. I was thinking, I would share.
Yeah, and I think if that's the case, and that would be, Nick and I could be the clearinghouse for those, just send us that tool, pile them together, because we don't want to be having exchanges back and forth. Just send it to me, and then we'll put all the notes together and get it out to you, just by the Friday of the meeting, so that you can see what everybody's. And then maybe that spurs an organizational idea of condense it down to something that is easier to digest for whoever is hearing. This is where, committees are saying things, and that's really the case. But we got a better feel for, so that we're not surprised by another commission just being, say, we just be out of left field, issue that we haven't anticipated.
So we're saying by June 9th, we would all send our notes to you for Nick again.
Is there a format that's easiest? Because that's
Well, I think that the key is really prioritize. This is what I think is pretty most important. And then trying to provide nuance to that. Well, we can, if everybody sort of got that format in mind, we're going to put together the top 12 things from all of these other advisory reports. Then you can anticipate a fairly easy to digest document saying, we've been talking to this. So and here's what you think of the issues.
That's great. Thanks for doing that. Can I bring post-its and bring this post-its and?
Sure.
What's your idea, just so that we don't negotiate that the day of, if we've all come with notes from our individual committees that we've been visiting with, then what would that post activity look like?
well, just the assumption that we've all looked at the comp plan and that we've all had a chance to look at the priorities. And then because I noticed that when we were going through the different, as we were going through the comp plan quickly, I noticed that there were certain little things that state of climate action, like the climate agenda. Use a post-it in that section to identify what's missing. That should be different. It's something that's maybe if we have sense of eyes on it, then we hopefully will get this. It's like about these subtle changes that are before us, whether it's the missing middle, how to give one of the issue. And just because the comp plan is a very nice document, but the lens with which it was created has changed. And so just really being able to identify those subtle changes again, with having looked at all the priorities given by the different committees, we can incorporate that and see if it's missing.
So it sounds like you're saying it's a broader activity of us spending that time we have together in June to sort of pre-identify things that appear to be missing or need revisions.
Exactly.
So that we're flagging the comp plan in advance of the.
Yes, so that was more for Paul to have actually looked at it and, but through the lens again, if we can get.
Right.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to get, so when we do get to consult it kind of all forces us to be on the same page, right? As well as kind of identifying gross macro areas that we see deficiencies in. Maybe there aren't many, but I think there were points as we, I remember as we were going through it, with regard to housing and climate change, it really is just how those areas are missing. So if we all are calibrated, at least understand the document, then I think when the consultant does come on board, it becomes a more meaningful engagement. So it's a tool for us to all basically, just go through a little finer kind of mindset, and then we can all be speaking the same language. So it not only identifies things, but also forces us to.
So then the homework would be not only to get current, if you're not already on the board or the commission or committee that you were signed up for, to be more familiar with their priorities, but to comprehensively look at the comp plan, considering the new legislation, considering what you know about your particular committee and safe streets and everything else, and come with a marked up version of the comp plan, and then we can talk about.
Right, and or post the buffer, yeah, it's some way to identify as a group that, did we see this, or maybe somebody saw something, but, that way we can. And it's not to say we're gonna hash out the language of that, but just really seeing areas of efficiencies or areas, that, needed to be, that really are a little outdated. And I think there are just a couple of areas that we're going through with regard to climate change, but subtle, but, yeah, again, as a tool to get us all on the same page.
Okay, so I had, Sherry, you were the tree board, okay, and, Louis, you and I were the climate action committee, David tree board also, public works, Melissa, you were public works, right?
I'll be happy to be Public Works. I actually didn't have a committee yet, but that sounds good.
Okay, yeah, that's what we talked about, Birch. And then Action, you were parks, along with Meredith. And then Sam, do you believe it's office?
We only had like 3 other committees.
Yeah.
So. But that's part of the city council.
Yeah.
So, I think we're trying to just, at this point, just to advise you. So, if, we want, I think when we talk about public works, Melissa, I'm just talking about public works department. So I'd be happy to help you set up a meeting with the new public works director. If you want to do that.
Yeah, that sounds
and then-
great.
And will you and Melissa work on that one? Then you can be doubled up, because all the rest of them have doubles of community. Okay. Very good. So we will have a meeting in June, and we'll come prepared to identify what we see. I'm sure the consultant will have, will be able to help us on things we missed, because not only have legislation, we'll come prepared to flag our comp plan with the areas that we feel pretty confident need our time management. Could it be in a format of a work party then? Is that, does it have to be a formal meeting?
We have
It doesn't have to, we don't have to go through the agenda, just have to call it. Order and then. 40 minutes, what happened.
Okay.
This is now required to do hybrid meetings, so if anybody wants to attend. Can. But yeah, we can be very open in terms of
But yeah, we'll be at public meetings, people can, if you want.
So the council has work sessions, so.
Can we bring food? I guess that's.
Okay, let's really get down to it. Let's start with you.
Beer and pizza.
And
And I'll bring you.
I don't know if this would be a good time to do this as well, but I felt like just in terms of organization, and I felt like there were a lot of repetition of the same ideas in a couple of the different elements. And so that's kind of when I was putting post-its, I was like, okay, well, this was already covered in one. Or, is there a better way that we can organize it so that all of the same ideas are clumped together? And I think that we could even shrink the whole document by making sure that it's all very organized. So maybe that would be another thing.
Above that, yeah, I would agree with that.
Although I think we have to remember that this is why we're hiring a consultant
Yeah.
to do much of this work. So there's not, I think it's really good to be familiar with the document and using this as a tool to get familiar with the document. It's a good idea, but there's a little bit, yeah. I think, I could be wrong.
Doesn't hurt to ask the question.
Yeah.
We need the redundancy.
Oh, you're right. If we go through this exercise, we'll walk in with the consultant ready, or, really immersed in it and be ready to be more strategic and less sort of learning as we go. I think that's great. All right.
Does it make sense to get the priorities and the support here? Here then?
You mean the report out from the committee?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've agreed to email our summaries to team.
Yeah. Top priorities.
Okay.
Like,
About the.
That's right. Yeah, maybe you.
So you and I can talk about that, like.
Yes,
Yeah. And I think that doesn't violate any public meetings, it's just two people are saying, here's what I heard, and it's statement down. Right, but like if Sam and Melissa had a meeting with Public Works and sort of agreed these are the top three things we heard since one document versus Sam sitting his own, and Melissa sitting their own.
Yeah, that's fine. They said
Right.
they want-
That's what I mean. So Sam and Melissa could come up with your sort of summary that you're gonna send Steve. Lois and I'll do that for climate action. Meredith, you'll do that with Ashton, and then tree board, David and Sheree. All right. So you not only have to work, but you get to collaborate legally. Okay, well, I don't want to draw this out any longer than we have to. It sounds like we have a plan for June. And I'm gonna take us then into new business. Any new business to discuss?
No.
Any reports or announcements?
Go with the-
And we don't have anybody here, so there are no citizen comments. We've effectively just decided our agenda for our next meeting, so that takes us to adjourning. I mean, is there anything else that we need to discuss? I mean, besides, if anybody's interested, we can even go get beer, like after a meeting, if we're all together. No, we had to, I was listening, you were talking to the climate action committee and they were like, what do you mean we can't have a party together?
I'm pretty sure that I will either be in.
Feel free to send any notes, and if you're not gonna join us, feel free to send us, and we'll make sure that your voice is represented. And thanks for setting a good example. Okay, well, does anyone want to make a motion to end this? Good, adjourn. Second. And all those in favor of adjourning, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Aye. Opposed or just a moment? Okay. We can't. I mean, we can. Oh, we cannot be here, but we can. Okay. All right. Okay, then I push picture too. All right, happy picture.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And we're gonna, it's 7 o'clock, you know, you don't want to start any earlier, right? But a good time for everybody. You could start early with dinner, but I think it just keep it simple. Come hungry if you want pizza, you know, if you don't. eat it.
Might be good, that's 6:30, we get the food over, then we do the work at 7.
6:30? Did you say that was June 9th?
No, that's. Trying to get church.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, we need to know the time.